First off, I'd like to thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
And could you start us off by introducing yourself, what your title is, and what occupation you currently hold?
Sure. I'm Diane Gleason. I'm an assistant professor of history at Arkansas Tech University.
All right. So let's just get right to it. Where and when were you born?
I was born at St. Vincent's Infirmary in Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1948.
Do you have any siblings?
I do. I have two older sisters and one younger brother.
All right. What city have you lived in most of your life in Arkansas?
Most of my life I've lived in Dardanelle.
Okay. What was it like growing up there?
It was nice. It was good. Growing up in the 1950s was a different world than it is today. I think people, well, the town was quite different. It was a much more up-and-coming, prosperous, progressive community at that time. And just life in general, society was different at that time.
So what would you do for fun as a young girl? What would you?
What my parents were in business, and they had a store on Front Street, and they worked 6 days a week, very hard. And my entire family was taught from a very early age, all my siblings and I, to work. And so I don't remember many, social sorts of things. Fun was being with family and working on a project and getting something done.
So did that mean you had only a few friends, or was it more family oriented?
It was mainly family oriented. I had friends in school, and but I don't think when I was a young child I felt particularly close to those people. They were acquaintances that I liked and enjoyed being around, but the real focus of my childhood was my family.
So speaking of school, where did you attend grade school?
I went to Dardanelle schools, public schools.
All right. So in the 50s, so how was school different then as opposed to it is now?
Oh, Lord. Well, it was a lot easier, for one thing. I don't think public schools generally, at least those I attended, were as rigorous as they are today. It was, of course, at the time I thought it was terribly rigorous, but I don't think comparatively with current standards it was. We went to school classes started at 8 in the morning, ended at 3:30 in the afternoon, and the only time I ever missed is when I was really sick and Mother wouldn't let me go. So.
All right. So you attended Dardanelle grade school. So did you also attend Dardanelle High School as well?
I did.
All right. Was there any big differences between high school then as it is now? Would you say it's about the same as grade school?
No, I think it was, to repeat what I said earlier, I think all public schools today are much more rigorous and demanding, and the curriculum is more well thought out and more challenging than it was 60 some odd years ago when I was going to school. Yeah.
So we've already talked about your childhood. Now let's talk about your teenage years. Did you get any more fun or any more independence, or was it still business, family oriented?
It was business and school and family and work. Yeah.
Any kind of social functions that you ever
I
went
went to school dances. I was a member of the band in high school for the last several years. I was in high school, and of course that meant band trips to football games and tryouts and all of that kind of thing. But I don't remember any major social events other than, school dances, junior, senior proms, those kinds of things.
Could you compare those to like today? Would you still think that they were about the same back then as they are today?
No, I think they were much more low-key at that time. I know that a lot of young ladies today will spend, a a great deal of money on prom terraces, and young men will rent limousines, and you'll go to, Little Rock or whatever for dinner. I remember junior, senior prom, wearing my Sunday dress, and going to a local restaurant and having dinner and thinking it was really a grand occasion. And it was for that time. So, much more low-key.
Are there any interesting stories that you have regarding your life in Arkansas?
When I was a child, my father had a cattle farm, a very fine cattle farm, registered polled Herefords, one of the finest herds in the world. And we had 1,000 acres of land. And my summers were spent mainly on horseback, checking cattle, counting herds, being sure everything was okay. And that was fun. It gave me definitely something to do. It gave me a job to do, purpose, rather than laying around the house being a lazy bum. And I very much enjoyed that. I don't know of anything terribly funny. I remember a childhood that was very purpose-driven, very happy, loving childhood, a family that ate dinner together every evening, and we discussed major events in the news and major world events, and children were expected to contribute to that discussion and conversation. And it was it was a great childhood. I was very proud to be a member of my family, and felt an obligation to live up to their standards of achievement.
So going back to you were talking about at the dinner table, you would talk about like current events. How would you get the information for that? Was it through the radio, newspaper?
Television, newspapers. I read the Arkansas Gazette every day, as did my mother and father, and I guess my siblings did. And we watched the evening news every evening. And I was a real news junkie. So it was, and I read several news magazines when I was a kid.
So are there any current events that really stick out in your mind that...
Well, I remember all about the beginnings of the civil rights movement. The Little Rock crisis and the reaction and the closing of the Little Rock schools, and that there were personalities here in the River Valley area that were taking part in that, and I had very strong opinions and about who was right and who was wrong and what ought to happen. So it was a very dynamic period.
Let's talk about your parents a little bit. What kind of occupation were they in? What kind of business did they own?
My parents were co-owners of a general country store. It was called the Dardanelle Mercantile, and it was a huge building. I bet it was close to probably 7,500 square feet. And it was groceries and dry goods and furniture and shoes and meat and a meat market and feed. And so it was a complete store. That store had been started by my great uncles in 1883. And then my grandfather, Jack Boyce, bought into it. And then in 1937, my mother and father started working there as employees, and they bought in as co-partners in the late 40s.
Okay, so you said it was more of a family-owned, so did they hire out any kind of positions? Did they hire other
there were
employees?
about 15 people that worked there. This was a huge operation.
Okay.
We had 2 or 3 backroom men that dealt with feed. We had a group of people who worked in the grocery department. We had a group of people who worked over in the dry goods area. We sold dresses and men's clothing and sewing notions and patterns, as well as furniture and shoes. So the dry goods was a complete, apparel business, and then the grocery business, and then the meat market. We had a butcher who ran that. And then the back room where we had feed and seed and all of that material for farmers.
And so did you and your siblings all work there at some time or another?
I wouldn't say we worked there. We were there all the time. I basically grew up in that store. Mother managed the books, and so she would go to work. She'd be there at 8 o'clock in the morning and leave at 5:30 in the afternoon. And when I was preschool, I simply went up and stayed at the store with her all that time while she worked, and I roamed around and pestered people. But, you know, we all did a little work, but we were pretty young to actually do much true work. We were kept busy with small tasks around the store.
So you probably saw the different kinds of customers that...
Saw a lot of different kinds of people. Yeah.
So what do you think would be the normal customer that you would see on a daily basis?
We saw a lot of working class families. During the weekday, you would see townspeople who would come in to buy their groceries or whatever they needed. And, you know, these were people who would sometimes put everything on a in-store credit. And so every month they were billed for what they owed. And so obviously they were not affluent enough to just come in and pay cash for whatever they wanted. And they were always very cautious about prices, and my parents were very cautious about pricing their goods, so they were competitive. There were 5 grocery stores in Dardanelle, and so there was steep competition for prices of standard items like bread, milk, eggs. You know, you had to be competitive or you weren't going to stay in business. Price-wise, had to be competitive. Then on the weekends, you would see the farm families who would come to town, and that was just fascinating. These people would come to town early in the morning. They would normally buy their groceries first, and the groceries would be gathered in wire baskets and put in the back room by the back door of the store, because these people would park in the big alley behind the store, a huge area. I can even remember a few people, even in my early childhood, coming to town with horse and wagons. Most, of course, had cars. But they would park back there, and if they had animals, we kept a little hay to put the hay out for the animals, you know, and water. And then they'd go buy their groceries. They'd be gathered up in wire baskets with their name on them and left by the back door. And then the rest of the day, those people would go about town, and they might go to the post office, they might go to the movies to see a double feature in the afternoon. They might go down to one of the beer halls and drink some beer and shoot some pool, whatever. But they spent the entire day in Dardanelle. And this was their day away from the labor and the hard work of the farm. And then late at night, when they got ready to go home, they'd come by the store and pick up their groceries and be gone. The store on Saturdays was open till 12 midnight, because a lot of farm families didn't go home until, 10 or 11 or 12 at night. And otherwise, the store was open from 6 in the morning till 6 at night, the other 5 days of the week. So it was a wonderful place to grow up.
So was it closed on Sunday then?
Closed on Sunday.
Okay. Were most businesses closed on Sunday?
Yeah. In the 50s, you didn't start seeing a breakdown of the blue laws in Arkansas until really the early 1980s. Until then, people weren't open on Sundays. You could find a gas station maybe by the highway that was open, but grocery stores were closed. All the major businesses were closed. Department stores in Little Rock were closed on Sundays. But the blue laws in Arkansas started breaking down and being repealed in the late uh, 1970s and early 1980s.
All right. So you said that were there 5 other stores along with your parents' store,
There
or
were
was
five,
it
five
total?
So
Okay.
4 competitors.
So was your family's the largest, or were they around the middle or the smallest?
They were probably the largest in size and in volume.
Well, even with customers, or do you think more people
I think
people
they were
shopped?
probably one of the leading stores. I don't know if they were. I have no idea about sales figures and such. Uh, but I do know that my parents were very good business people, worked very hard, and were very careful with their money. They realized how hard it was to earn a living, and they had known that all of their lives. Uh, so they were careful with their money. They reinvested it wisely, carefully. They never wasted anything. Uh, we took 2 family vacations when I was a child. In their entire lives, they took 2 vacations. And on both of those vacations, every morning, my father would get in the car on the vacation. He'd say, "Okay, hurry up, let's get through this day. We got to go home and get back to work." And so they loved work, and they instilled all of that in each of their children.
So how long did they have the store?
Oh, well, like I said, they went to work there in the store in the mid to late 1930s, and the store sold in let me think what the year was, probably about 1962. And at that time, my father went full-time with his cattle operation, which he started in 1948 as a side venture. And so he ran that, and Mother for a period of time taught English, and then she taught music, and then she and my sister opened their business in 1969, which is still in Dardanelle.
What business?
Malin's. It's a 5,000 square foot gifts and home accessory store.
So did you help out with that?
I help
venture
out.
as well?
Yeah, I do on occasion. I work there every Christmas, and I work there from Thanksgiving through Christmas every Sunday, because they're open Sunday afternoons from Thanksgiving through Christmas.
So what kind of work did that involve?
That work?
Yes.
Oh, well, that work involves waiting on customers and wrapping gifts and selling merchandise to people.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what you were talking about earlier about how the farmers would come in and they would go to either the movie theater or the bar.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of entertainment was there available in Dardanelle for the average person?
The average person probably enjoyed the Joy Theater, the movie house, as much as anything. The Joy Theater was an old theater on Front Street, and it was just it was a great place. They had cowboy movies every Saturday afternoon, matinees that ran back to back with cartoon features in between. So you could buy a ticket and go and watch the movie twice and all the cartoons in between. And I think most people, we're talking the 50s, most people didn't have television until the mid-50s. I remember the first TV set we got was 1956, and there was one channel you could get, and it was speckly, So most people would, I think, enjoy the movies. There were simple pleasures. There were square dances at the Legion Hut. That people who liked to square dance did that. All the churches had Wednesday night services. Churches don't do that completely anymore. A lot of them don't. So Sunday school and church on Sunday morning, and Wednesday night church, and the movies, and maybe square dancing if you did that kind of thing. Or my parents played bridge, and they had a group of adult friends that they played bridge with, usually once a month, and that was kind of a big deal. They enjoyed that. But at this time, I think more people concentrated on their work and their family than they did their leisure time and their play. That's what I remember anyway.
So what about the teenagers? Were they more independent, or were they like their parents where they were more interested in work?
Well, I think teenagers are teenagers at any age, and they're always going to be interested in having some fun. But I think most teenagers were maybe a little bit more serious than they are today. You know, most teenagers didn't have their own cars, and a lot of these kids that I knew as kids came from family farms, and their parents relied on them to work on that farm quite a bit after school and on weekends. So, and the kids that lived in town as teenagers, I think probably had a little bit more leisure time than the children who lived in the country and on the farm. But I don't think any of that age teenagers that I was aware of really spent a lot of time playing around. I just don't think it was done as much as it is today.
All right. Well, whenever people think of the 50s, the stereotypical thing usually is sock hops and soda parlors. Were any of those available in Dardanelle
Well,
at that time?
we didn't have a soda parlor as such. We did have Jagger's Drugstore on Front Street that had a ice cream and soda bar at the side front of the store. And it was fun. You could go in there and get a limeade or a chocolate soda, and that was fun. But it was a functioning drugstore. It just had that little element on the side. Sock hops, I don't remember any sock hops. I do remember going to pick up my sisters at some of their dances, school dances, and as a young child, Mother would take me along. You know, somebody had to stay with me, so I would go and we would pick up my sisters, and you know, they had a date, but their parents brought them to the dance. And I can remember the boys always had on the white jackets and bow ties and a coronation, and the girls always had full-length Kremlin kinds of evening wear. You know, so it wasn't. And you know, sock hops. I remember the Oxford shoes and the bobby socks, but that was daily wear for young ladies, along with the poodle skirts and all of that. But the dances that I remember were kind of formal school dances.
Okay, so you mentioned the dress. Let's talk about a little bit about the different kinds of dress that you would see on a daily basis during the 50s. Like, what would men wear normally? Because usually the stereotype for younger men was like the leather jacket, whereas women wore
Hollywood.
Exactly, that's how it's portrayed.
What I saw in the young people in Dardanelle in the 50s was that if they were from the countryside, the rural kids, they would wear, sometimes they would still wear overalls. Or they would wear very plain cotton shirts and jeans. And if you were from town and you were a man, a young man, you would notice that the townspeople were dressed better than the kids from the country. There would be a noticeable difference in the quality of their clothing. So there was just a little bit more affluence in town than there was out the country. And you would notice the same thing with most of the girls. You know, the shirtwaist dress was the standard kind of dress for young ladies at this time. Culottes, which you probably don't even know what that is. Looks like a skirt, but they're pants. And but it has a flap over the front, so it has the profile of a skirt, culottes were very big in the 50s and into the early 60s. But you would notice a difference whether a person came from the country or the town based on how they dressed.
All right, so that was the teenagers. What about the older generation? Were
The
they
same.
more? They were
The same.
okay.
I remember my father, much to my mother's disgust, liked to wear khaki pants to the store and a dress shirt because he worked. He worked hard. He might do book work. He might do that. He might unload a 18-wheeler that came in. He and the other man in the store would unload it. So, I mean, it was a lot of hard physical work. The men in the country all almost wore overalls. I remember one very large, overweight man who was an excellent sharecropper, and everybody in town knew him, and he was a very good sharecropper, well established, had been doing it, he and his brothers, for years, and he was quite obese, and his overalls barely would fit, and he would not wear any shirt or anything underneath his overalls, so when he sat down, you saw a little bit more than you really wanted to. And he would sit down on Front Street on the stoop of some of the stores on Saturday afternoon and sit there and chew and spit and talk to the other farmers who were in town. But I still have this visual image of that man. But most of the farm people wore overalls, and the farm women, when they came to town, wore very plain shirt-waists, cotton dresses. Not much ornamentation in their dress.
All right, and you also mentioned earlier about how the farmers would go to bars. When did so there were
Dardanelle was wet,
okay.
and you had liquor stores, and you had pool halls and bars in town. And there was now I may be off on this date a little bit, sometime in the late 50s, and I think it was probably around 55 or 56, Dardanelle voted to go dry. And there was a huge argument in town over that. Some of the businessmen felt like it would hurt their business. Some of the people in town felt like it would improve the morals of the town. You'd see drunks lying in the gutter early in the morning, passed out. And, that's not exactly wholesome. So, but it narrowly voted itself dry in the late 50s. But prior to then, there was a street that the young men of the town referred to as Tough Street, because it had a lot of kind of rough, what we might call juke joints, low-end bars and pool tables and such. And, that's where some people went to drink a lot of beer and be rowdy. Tough Street.
So on that vote, do you know if your parents voted for or against it?
My mother voted for it. My father voted against it.
Okay. What would you say the reasoning would be behind voting for and against?
Well, what I just said, voting for going dry would improve the morals of the community, would get the drunks out of the gutter, would keep so many inebriated people from roaming around town. Voting against it, the primary justification was that without the liquor stores and the draw that causes, we'll probably have less business in town, and that'll hurt business for everybody, whether you're in the liquor business or not. And of course it did.
So were any of the adjoining counties wet at this time, or were they mostly dry, such as Pope County?
Pope County was dry. Johnson was dry. I think Logan may have been wet. I think most of them were dry.
So that would definitely hurt
did.
businesses.
It did. I think the sense of the town changed once it went dry.
So would you say the sense, was it a better sense, or was it, or do you think it was more of
It
a
depends on what
bad
you
sense?
think better is. I mean, you know, if you think drinking is bad and all that goes with it is detrimental, then yeah, it was improved. If you think, well, that's just letting people be free to make choices, then it wasn't. I do know it hurt the town economically.
Do you think there was less customers coming
Yeah,
in because
yeah.
less of the farmers, or was it
Well,
just
the
less
farmers
people in
are still
general?
going to come in, but you know, what happened when the town went dry, rather than going downtown to purchase your liquor and maybe going to some other businesses or going into one of these kind of dive bars and having a drink, what people did is they went down the highway and bought their liquor and then went home. So yeah, I think it took their money out of that town somewhere else and caused a general decrease in activity.
Do you think it affected your parents' store at all?
Probably not. Probably not tremendously, because most of my parents' business was based on farmers, and some of those people had their own stills and ran their own bootlegging operation, and they didn't depend much on town liquor, and they were going to come to town on Saturday anyway.
So let's talk about the different kinds of automobiles. I mean, you said that there were wagons and carts, but what kind of different automobiles do you think were the norm in Dardanelle? Like, what would you see? I wouldn't expect any hot rods or anything like that. I would think you would probably see more conservative cars.
Well, there was a Ford dealership in Dardanelle. There was a Chevrolet dealership in Dardanelle. There were several used car lots in Dardanelle. So, you know, you saw a lot of Chevys and Fords and Oldsmobiles and Buicks and, you know, the standard cars. A lot of farm people, of course, had trucks. I don't ever remember seeing any hot rods in Dardanelle. I'm sure there probably were kids and people that enjoyed that type thing, but I wasn't aware of it. There was a Willis Jeep dealership in Dardanelle. That was, you know, the kind of the World War II type Jeep. You know, cars were a big deal. The streets were narrow, and they had parking on both sides of the streets on Front Street, and it's the same size as it is now. So driving down Front Street was always an adventure to try not to hit the cars on the right or the left. There was one older woman, and I don't remember her name. My sisters would, who was basically legally blind, but she still drove, and she drove a great big old Buick, and I remember it's white and kind of a brownish color. And when she would start at one end of Front Street, people would run into the businesses and shout, "Miss So-and-so's coming down the street, move your cars." And it was just hilarious because everybody would race out and move their cars and get them off Front Street because she took the entire street because she didn't see. And, you know, she was never arrested. It was just one of those small town events, which I think is great.
All right, so we're kind of shift away from society. So let's talk a little bit about the politics of the town. What type of government, local government, would you say ran the town at this time?
There was a mayor and a town council, still is today. I really don't remember. I have no memory of the town local politics when I was a child. I do know that there was one family that was really big in politics in Yale County for probably 40, 50 years. And the word was that they bought elections all the time, and they stayed in power in that way. What I do remember about the politics of my childhood was the school board. And my dad was on the school board, was president of the school board, and nothing gets people as riled up as school board politics. And I remember a lot of talk and discussion, a lot of activity about those races, and why he wanted to be on the board and what problems he wanted to solve and all that. So that was kind of the focus of my local political orientation.
Okay. Again, I'd like to thank you for your time.
Sure.
Thank you for allowing me to interview you.
No problem. Always happy to talk about Dardanelle, Yale County, Arkansas.
All right.
Okay.
That was Dr. Diane Gleason.